then the boys will grow up and get into relationships, and they're expecting sex to be like that. So they're really ill prepared because it's not something that's being talked about by their family members most of the time. Their friends who they're getting a lot of advice from don't know much. And then the porn is not an educational material, it's not an educational thing, but it's used that way, right? Because that's where people go to learn for years and years and years in the privacy of their own bedroom, wherever they're at, on their cell phones nowadays. And I think all of that contributes to the challenges that they begin to have when they are in long-term committed relationships.
And like also too, like parents and how parents will position just things for young boys versus young girls in terms of like what's acceptable. Oftentimes young boys in the family can go on dates before, say, the sister could, if the sister could even at all. Things like this, for example. From your experience, like what is too early to be introducing that sort of conversation when you do have kids and you are trying to set them up to be well-rounded and successful? Like, when should parents really start talking to their kids about sex and things like that?
Whew, this is right up my alley. I just finished writing an entire dissertation about this.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And, when I was doing that, I learned a lot about how things are handled in other cultures and how the statistics show up in the United States versus how they show up in other places. And one of the things that I was reading was talking about how in Europe, oftentimes they start the children with learning about sex when they're in kindergarten. Now, they're obviously not teaching them what you would teach a 15-year-old about sex, but they're starting with things like consent. They're starting with, when they touch your arm like that and you don't like it, you tell them, I don't like it when you touch my arm like that. Right? And if you teach a 5-year-old that, and then as they continue to grow each year, continue to add on to it and work your way up, when you get to high school and this person's trying to touch them, they're going to say, no, I don't like that. I don't want you to touch me like that. Right? Because their voice has been given to them. They have the voice. They've learned the words, right? And they understand that it's okay for them to say that. And that's just a small example, but just by starting them really young and starting to add to their knowledge as they grow, that's what I would recommend. The second thing that I would say is something that I learned. I'm a parent, and I remember when my first son was growing up, he was really little, and I learned that you want to have conversations with them when they start asking questions, right? Oftentimes people ask questions, especially related to sex, and the parents will shy away from the questions because parents oftentimes don't want to feel the discomfort of having these kinds of conversations, but they need to be had, right? And if we avoid and try to give them a little story about a stork dropping off babies and stuff like that, we're really doing them a disservice, because then they're going to go and hear more from other people, and it might not be the message that you want them to hear. So I would encourage parents, so as your children start asking questions, to just be open and honest about the questions, right? Telling them the names of body parts. If it's called a vulva, call it a vulva. Don't call it a poo-poo or a pee or anything extra, cuckoo. Like, that's not helping anybody.
Scientific from the start. Like, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's helping you to feel more comfortable, but in the long run, you're really doing the child a disservice.
Do you think that conversation should look different for a young person if one is a different gender, say a male versus a female, or a young boy versus a young girl? Do you think one should be exposed to certain information before the other, or certain types of, or the curriculum should look different based on that at all?
No. I think that we all need the information. I think that all children need the information. I could see something like the period talk being something that maybe you talk to a girl about, and maybe the boy can find out about that a little bit later. That's the only thing that I could even think of. But even with that, why can't they know what's going on? This is human development. Just like if we were going to talk about any other part of human development, we just need to normalize talking about sex. And also another thing that I like to remind people of is that this is not intended to be a one-time conversation. They always show it on TV. Even when I was growing up, they would show on TV the birds and the bees talk. like it's a one-time thing, right? But we need to have ongoing conversations. So when they first start asking about where do babies come from, you give them some information about where do babies come from. You don't necessarily have to give them all the information, but what can you share with them developmentally appropriate that someone their age needs to know and could understand? What can you share with them that's going to help them to be like, okay, I feel like I got some information today. Like, I feel like I know the answer to the question that I asked. And then as they get older, when more questions come up, when the topics of, oh, I want to have a boyfriend or I want to have a girlfriend, when those kinds of conversations come up, then you have additional conversations.
I like the ongoing piece because it's continuous. Like you said, and especially when you're dealing with the young folks and they're always going through so much rapidly, like the information changes. And I appreciate you just kind of having this conversation with me because like, again, I think it's just a new world. It's a new day in terms of how kids are growing up, what is normal to them, what was versus normal to our generation or my generation or my parents' generation. Like it's just a new day. The tools that we need as a community just to ensure that everybody's able to cope and process all of this stuff in a healthy way, I think is one of the reasons why I just appreciate you having this conversation with me. Excuse me. It leads me to, do you think there's like too young where we don't want to promote, like, so let me take a step back because I think we've said that the society has changed a bit. Some might argue for the better. Some say this is like a liberating time. And I guess my question is that potentially, what is too young for people to really be participating in such a grown act as sex? Like from a professional standpoint, like, is there a such thing as like, they're probably too young to be doing this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that the people are going to do what they're going to do, right? And the response or the hope that I would have in all of that is that they would be mature enough to have an idea of what they're doing, right? I think that just to put an age on it, I would say before middle school would be in my opinion too young. And I know that even when I do for as a therapist, when we're talking about consent and we're talking about children being able to, for example, go to the doctor by themselves without their parent knowing, or get birth control without their parent knowing. The different states have their different laws, but I know in California it's age 12. You know, when they start having relationships with people who are within a few years of them, in California we actually have like a whole graph that shows if they're, for example, if they're 12 years old and their partner's 15 years old, then that's okay. That's like not reportable. If they're 12 years old and their partner's 16 years old, okay, that's now reportable, and now we may need to let the authorities know. So that's the number I would give, since you're asking for a number. But honestly, it really depends on the maturity of the person, right? And oftentimes a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old is probably not really completely aware of what's going on. And they probably don't know much about their bodies. They probably don't understand much about relationships. If someone is involved in a sexual relationship when they're that young, it's probably not the healthiest relationship. So I guess that's my answer on it.